The old Ford pickup groaned in protest as it climbed the narrow mountain road, shedding smooth asphalt for rough gravel like a snake shedding its skin. Jake Thompson kept a steady hand on the worn steering wheel, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. For the last hour, the world had been shrinking around him, the vast open sky reduced to a thin ribbon of blue between the dense canopies of ancient oaks and towering hickories. Here, in the deep folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, civilization felt like a distant memory, a chaotic dream from which he was finally awakening. Beside him sat Storm, motionless and alert. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, a magnificent animal whose coat was a rare silver gray that gleamed like polished metal in the dappled sunlight filtering through the forest canopy. His intelligent amber eyes tracked the passing trees, ears twitching at each unfamiliar sound of the mountain wilderness. Storm was more than Jake's companion. He was his anchor, the steady-breathing presence that kept the ghosts of Syria at bay. Jake reached over his calloused hands, settling on the thick fur of Storm's neck. The dog leaned into the touch, a low rumble of contentment vibrating in his chest. No words were needed between them. Their bond had been forged in the screaming chaos of a field hospital in Damascus and tempered in the quiet desperation of the years that followed. At 35, Jake wore the landscape of his past on his face like a roadmap of hard miles. He was tall and lean with the wiry strength that his faded flannel shirt couldn't hide. His brown hair, still cut in the military style he'd never abandoned, showed threads of silver at the temples that hadn't been there 2 years ago. His face, weathered by desert sun and mountain wind, held a kindness in the eyes that hadn't been extinguished by what they had seen. 3 tours as a Navy SEAL had earned him a chest full of medals, a permanent ache in his right shoulder, and nightmares that medication couldn't touch. The fourth deployment had broken something deeper than bone or muscle. The mission in the Syrian mountains had gone catastrophically wrong in ways that still didn't make sense to him. His entire 6-man team had been hit by some kind of chemical attack while securing a supposed weapons cache. Jake had been the only one to survive, found 3 days later by a Marine patrol delirious and barely breathing. The official report blamed it on an improvised chemical weapon deployed by insurgents, but something about that explanation had never sat right with him. The attack had been too precise, too surgical. 4 of his closest friends and brothers-in-arms had died in agony while he lay unconscious just yards away, somehow spared by whatever poison had claimed them. The questions haunted him more than the memories of their final moments. Jake's hope for peace, his last desperate gamble at finding some kind of normalcy, was invested entirely in a piece of paper tucked into his glove compartment. The deed to 40 acres of forgotten land in the mountains of Virginia, purchased from the estate of a man named Michael Chen. It had been a strange transaction, handled entirely through lawyers and real estate agents. Chen had been a freelance journalist who'd bought the property 5 years earlier, then apparently abandoned it after less than a year of sporadic visits. The price had been so low, it seemed like a mistake. Jake had poured the last of his disability payments and savings into the purchase, his heart hammering against his ribs, until the confirmation email arrived. 40 acres of trees rock in blessed solitude. A place to build a wall against the world, not with bricks and mortar, but with silence and distance. The voice of his old squad mate, Marcus Williams, echoed in his mind from their last conversation 6 months ago. "It's perfect for someone like you, Jake. Middle of nowhere, quiet as a tomb. Previous owner was some tree-hugger journalist type who couldn't hack the isolation. County's practically giving it away. Just what you need to get your head straight." Marcus had seemed unusually knowledgeable about the property for someone living 3 states away, but Jake hadn't questioned it at the time. He'd been too desperate for an escape, too eager to disappear into somewhere the memories couldn't follow. The gravel track ended abruptly in a small clearing dominated by a simple single-story cabin. The structure stood before them like something from another era, its wooden walls weathered to a soft silver gray. A fieldstone chimney stood sentinel at one end, and a covered porch wrapped around the front, supported by thick log posts that spoke of solid craftsmanship. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was sturdy, isolated, and most importantly, it was his. "Well, boy, we're home." Jake's voice was raspy from disuse, the words feeling strange and hopeful on his tongue. He cut the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute, a living thing, textured with the distant calls of birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. For the first time in months, the frantic noise in Jake's own head seemed to quiet, subdued by the profound peace of the mountains. They spent the first hour walking the perimeter of their new kingdom. Jake moved with a long, ground-eating stride that spoke of countless miles covered on foot in hostile territory. His worn work boots sank slightly into the damp earth, and his slight shoulder injury was more pronounced after the long drive. But the pain was familiar, almost comforting in its constancy. Storm trotted at his side tail held high, his nose working constantly as he cataloged a vast library of new scents and possibilities. The property was a perfect mix of rolling hills and dense hardwood forest, with a small crystal-clear stream cutting through the southern edge like a silver thread. A natural spring bubbled up near the eastern boundary, the water so pure and cold it made Jake's teeth ache when he cupped it in his hands to drink. It was pristine, untouched, a sanctuary carved from wilderness that had stood unchanged for centuries. As they approached the western boundary, a steep wooded hillside that rose sharply toward a rocky outcrop crowned with ancient oaks, Storm's behavior changed dramatically. The confident trot slowed to a hesitant walk. His tail lowered and the fur along his spine bristled slightly, standing on end like the hackles of a wolf sensing danger. He stopped dead in his tracks, a low whine escaping his throat. "What is it?" Storm Jake asked quietly, stopping beside his companion and scanning the hillside with eyes trained by years of combat to spot anomalies to see the thing that didn't belong. He saw nothing but trees and shadows, heard no sound beyond the normal whisper of wind through leaves. There was no unusual scent on the breeze that he could detect, no sign of recent human presence or animal activity. But Storm backed away a step, his ears flat against his skull, in a display of anxiety Jake had rarely seen from the normally fearless dog. Storm looked up at him with amber eyes filled with definite unease, communicating as clearly as words that something was wrong with this place. He would not take another step in that direction, would not be coaxed or commanded to approach whatever invisible threat his superior senses had detected. Jake had seen Storm face down armed insurgents without flinching and walk calmly through artillery bombardments that sent seasoned soldiers diving for cover. This was different. This was a deep, instinctual rejection of the place that spoke to dangers beyond human understanding. "Okay," Jake said softly, resting a reassuring hand on the dog's head. "Okay, boy, we'll leave it be." He trusted Storm's instincts, without question, had learned during their years together that the dog's senses were far more reliable than human judgment in detecting threats both seen and unseen. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks and paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake started the process of making the cabin truly his. He unloaded his few possessions from the truck bed, setting a cooler full of supplies and several boxes of personal belongings on the weathered porch boards. The simple act of creating a home, of putting down roots, however shallow, sent a small current of satisfaction through him that he hadn't felt in years. Storm, having apparently shaken off his earlier mood, was investigating the edges of the clearing with renewed enthusiasm. He sniffed around a patch of overgrown weeds that might have once been a vegetable garden, his tail wagging as he discovered the layered scents of small animals and interesting plants. The normalcy of it, the simple pleasure his companion took in exploration, helped ease Jake's lingering concerns about the western hillside. Suddenly, Storm went rigid. His playful exploration ceased entirely, replaced by a singular, intense focus that Jake recognized from their operational days. The dog lowered his head to the ground near the abandoned garden patch, his nose twitching rapidly over a small area of disturbed soil and sparse grass. This was not the casual curiosity of a domestic pet chasing interesting smells. This was the precise, methodical behavior of a highly trained military working dog who had detected something significant. Storm began to whine, a different sound this time, a high-pitched note of urgency that raised the hair on the back of Jake's neck. The dog looked back at his handler with an expression of intense communication, then returned his attention to the ground and began to scratch at the earth with his front paws. Dirt flew as he dug with frantic energy, his entire body trembling with focus and purpose. Jake set down the box he was holding and walked over his boots, crunching on dry leaves and small twigs. "Easy, boy. What did you find?" But Storm ignored the gentle command, continuing to dig with absolute determination. His purpose was undeniable, his certainty complete. Jake knelt beside him, gently pushing the dog aside to examine what had captured his attention so completely. At first glance, it was just dirt and exposed roots, nothing more than the kind of disturbed soil you might find anywhere in a forest. But Storm's insistence was undeniable, And in all their years together, through combat zones and training exercises, the dog's instincts had never been wrong. They had kept Jake alive more than once when human senses would have failed him entirely. A familiar cold knot formed in Jake's stomach, the same sensation he'd learned to recognize as a harbinger of trouble during his military years. The perfect silent sanctuary he had bought for what seemed like a bargain price already held secrets, and his four-legged partner was telling him with absolute certainty that those secrets were buried right here beneath his feet. Jake stood up slowly and walked back to his truck, the peaceful silence of the mountains no longer feeling welcoming, but somehow watchful, as if unseen eyes were monitoring his every move from the dense forest that surrounded his new home. He pulled a folding and trenching tool from his carefully organized gear, the familiar weight of military equipment somehow both comforting and ominous in his hands. Whatever lay beneath the disturbed earth, Storm was adamant that it should not remain hidden. Jake had learned long ago to trust his partner's judgment in matters of life and death, and something in the dog's behavior suggested that this discovery would prove to be significant beyond anything he might have imagined when he'd made the decision to disappear into these ancient mountains. The shovel bit into the mountain soil with a solid thud, and Jake began to dig with a steady, efficient rhythm born from digging countless fighting positions and emergency shelters in landscapes far less forgiving than these gentle Virginia hills. Storm sat nearby, his body coiled with anticipation, watching every spadeful of dark earth that was tossed aside with the intensity of a sentry on watch. After several minutes of determined digging, the blade struck something hard with a jarring scrape of metal on metal. The sound was hollow, artificial, definitely not a rock or root. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the implications began to settle in his mind. He knelt in the shallow hole he'd created, setting the entrenching tool aside and using his hands to carefully clear the remaining soil and debris. His fingers brushed against a cold, corroded surface that felt like painted metal. Working methodically, he freed the object from the grip of earth and tangled roots. It was a small lockbox, no bigger than a cigar box, its surface pitted and brown with the rust of years spent buried in damp mountain soil. Despite its deteriorated appearance, it was surprisingly heavy in his hands, and the lock mechanism, though corroded, appeared to still be intact. Jake carried his find to the cabin porch, Storm trotting silently at his heels like a gray shadow. Using a pry bar from his toolkit, he carefully forced the rusted latch. The lid opened with a shriek of tortured metal that seemed unnaturally loud in the mountain stillness. Inside, resting on what had once been cloth, but was now little more than rotted fiber, lay several items that would change everything. A leather dog collar, cracked and faded with age, bore a hand-tooled name that was still legible despite the years. Atlas. Beside it lay a small leather-bound journal, its pages swollen and warped by moisture, but still intact enough to be readable. There was also a military-style dog tag, green with corrosion, but with lettering that could still be made out, and a USB drive in a waterproof case, its plastic housing partially melted, but potentially salvageable. Jake sat heavily on the top step of the porch, the box resting between his boots, as he tried to process what he discovered. He picked up the military identification tag, first wiping away decades of accumulated grime and oxidation. The name etched into the metal made his pulse quicken with recognition and growing dread. Michael Chen. The dates on the tag showed that Chen had served in the military during the same period Jake had been deployed overseas, though in a different capacity. Chen had been a combat correspondent, one of the brave journalists who embedded with military units to document the reality of modern warfare. Next, Jake carefully examined the journal, its cover cool and slightly slimy to the touch. With a gentle thumb, he fanned the pages open, releasing a musty smell of wet paper and decay. Much of the ink had bled and run, rendering many entries illegible blue clouds on warped paper. But near the middle of the journal, some pages had been better protected by the leather binding and remained readable. Jake began to piece together the fragmented entries, his military mind automatically organizing the scattered information into a pattern that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The journal documented Chen's growing suspicions about something called dark water industries and their operations in this remote area of Virginia. References to illegal chemical disposal, falsified environmental reports, and suspicious deaths among local wildlife created a narrative that made Jake's blood run cold. One entry, written in Chen's increasingly frantic handwriting, detailed his discovery of what appeared to be illegal testing of military-grade chemical compounds in the remote valleys surrounding this mountain. Another page mentioned clandestine meetings between Darkwater executives and local law enforcement, with particular attention paid to someone identified only as Sheriff Kane. The name sent ice through Jake's veins as he realized he might be about to meet this mysterious figure. The final readable entry was simple but chilling in its implications. They know I'm on to them. Atlas is the only one I can trust now. Evidence hidden at the Lightning Oak if something happens to me. Today's entry might be my last. The date was just over a year ago, shortly before Chen had supposedly abandoned the property and disappeared without a trace. Jake looked at the dog collar again, running his fingers over the worn leather that bore Atlas's name. Michael Chen had not simply walked away from this place as the real estate agents had suggested. He had disappeared under circumstances that were beginning to look increasingly sinister, and his loyal companion had vanished with him. The lockbox was Chen's insurance policy, a desperate attempt to ensure that someone would eventually discover the truth about whatever dark secrets were hidden in these mountains. Before Jake could process this information further, the peaceful evening air was shattered by the sound of an approaching engine. A white pickup truck with official markings was making its way slowly up the gravel driveway, kicking up a trail of dust in the fading light. As it drew closer, Jake could make out the seal of the county sheriff's department on the driver's door, and his stomach dropped as he realized who was about to pay him a visit. The truck parked behind Jake's Ford, and a man in a crisp sheriff's uniform stepped out, with the confident ease of someone accustomed to being the ultimate authority in his territory. He was in his mid-50s, a big man who filled out his uniform well without appearing soft. His hair was thick and silver white, combed back in a style that spoke of personal vanity, and his face was a roadmap of sun exposure and what might have been laugh lines if they reached his eyes. Sheriff Robert Kane moved with the easy confidence of a man who owned his space and wore a smile that was broad and welcoming in the way of professional politicians and career lawmen. But as he drew closer to the porch, Jake noticed that the smile never quite touched the man's pale, cold blue eyes, which seemed to catalog every detail of the scene with the precision of a predator assessing potential prey. Afternoon, Kane boomed his voice, carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Just wanted to come by and welcome you to our little corner of paradise. Name's Kane Sheriff Robert Kane. Jake stiffened at the name, the reference from Chen's journal burning in his mind like a warning beacon. He subtly shifted his position, blocking the open lockbox from the sheriff's view while maintaining a casual, welcoming posture. Storm, who had been lying peacefully beside the porch steps, rose to his feet in a single fluid motion that spoke of military training and constant readiness. The dog didn't bark or show obvious signs of aggression, but he positioned himself at Jake's side like a gray statue of potential force, his intelligent eyes fixed on the newcomer with an intensity that had suggested immediate and complete distrust. Jake Thompson, Jake replied, giving a short nod while his mind raced through the implications of Kane's unexpected visit. Appreciate you stopping by, Sheriff. Not a lot of visitors out this way, I imagine. Kane's laugh was hearty and practiced, but Jake caught the way the man's eyes swept over the property, taking in every detail of the cabin, the truck, and Jake himself with the thoroughness of a professional assessment. No, sir, not many folks choose to live this far from civilization. It's beautiful country, but it's got its stories, you could say. Kane's tone shifted slightly, taking on the cadence of a folksy storyteller, but Jake recognized the technique from his own training in psychological operations. The sheriff was probing, testing Jake's reactions while planting seeds of unease disguised as local folklore. Old-timers around here say strange things happen in these woods. Some say it's old Cherokee spirits still walking the ridgelines. Others reckon it's the ghosts of Confederate deserters who hid up here during the war. Strange lights in the forest at night, sounds on the wind when there's no breeze to speak of. Kane paused, deliberately studying Jake's face for any sign of concern or fear. The folks who owned this place before you, they were city people, left in quite a hurry, matter of fact. Guess the quiet got a little too loud for them, if you catch my meaning. Jake recognized the implied threat buried in the sheriff's friendly warning. Kane was telling him, in carefully coded language, that people who asked too many questions or stayed too long in this particular corner of the mountains had a tendency to disappear. I've heard my share of ghost stories, Sheriff Jake said, his voice level and betraying none of the tension coiling in his muscles. The quiet is exactly what I came here looking for. Kane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that Jake's combat-trained eye caught immediately. The sheriff had expected a different reaction, had hoped to plant enough fear to encourage Jake to pack up and leave before he could discover whatever secrets these mountains held. Well, that's good to hear, Mr. Thompson. Just thought I'd give you the neighborly heads up about the history of this place. Kane reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something that made Jake's blood freeze in his veins. It's best not to go poking around too much in these old mountains. Easy to get lost, and some things are better left buried. Kane held out a military challenge coin, the kind that special operations units exchanged as tokens of recognition and brotherhood. The coin was heavy solid silver by the feel of it and beautifully crafted. One side bore the traditional sheriff's badge design, but it was the reverse that sent shockwaves through Jake's system. Their embossed and intricate detail was a stylized raven inside a hexagon, identical to a symbol Jake had seen spray-painted on a concrete wall in Syria just hours before his team was attacked. We veterans need to look out for each other, don't you think? For Thompson Kane's voice had dropped to a more intimate tone, and his cold blue eyes were studying Jake's face with the intensity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. I can tell from the way you carry yourself that you've seen some action. Afghanistan. Iraq, maybe somewhere the government doesn't like to talk about. Jake's hand trembled. Almost imperceptibly as he took the coin, memories of Syria flooding back with brutal clarity. The raven symbol had been the last thing his teammate Rodriguez had photographed before their communications went dark. Intel had claimed it was just insurgent graffiti, but Jake had never believed that explanation. The symbol was too precise, too professional, too much like military unit insignia to be random vandalism. Syria, Jake replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Kane's smile widened, but there was nothing warm or friendly about it anymore. His expression had transformed into something predatory, the mask of rural hospitality finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. Interesting place, Syria. A lot of chemical weapons floating around over there. A lot of accidents. A lot of good men who never made it home because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Kane stepped closer to the porch, invading Jake's personal space in a move designed to intimidate. Throughout the entire exchange, Storm had remained a silent statue of barely contained aggression, but now a low guttural growl began to emanate from deep in his chest. The sound was felt more than heard, a vibration that spoke of imminent violence. Jake rested a hand on Storm's head, the gesture serving both as a command for restraint and a silent communication that said, "I see the threat too, boy. I'll keep that in mind." Sheriff Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding his system. Kane nodded slowly, his assessment of Jake visibly shifting as he recognized that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple veteran seeking rural isolation. The sheriff had revealed too much, shown his hand too early, and both men knew it. "All right then, Mr. Thompson. You know who to call if you need anything." Kane turned and walked back toward his truck, but Jake could feel the man's eyes on him, measuring, calculating, planning. As the sheriff's vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the still air, Jake looked down at the challenge coin in his palm. The raven symbol seemed to stare back at him like a malevolent eye, connecting his past trauma to his present sanctuary in ways that suggested his search for peace had led him directly into the heart of a conspiracy that had already claimed the lives of his teammates and an investigative journalist. The silence of the mountains had returned, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy, charged with unspoken threats and buried secrets. Sheriff Kane's visit had accomplished the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of frightening Jake into leaving, that had forged his determination to uncover the truth about what had happened to Michael Chen, what was happening in these mountains, and most importantly, what connection existed between the raven symbol and the death of his team in Syria. Storm pressed against Jake's leg, offering silent support as they both stared down the empty road. The dog's earlier reluctance to approach the western hillside now made perfect sense, and Jake realized that his loyal companion had been trying to warn him from the very beginning that this place held dangers that went far beyond mountain wildlife or natural hazards. The lockbox sat open beside him, its contents representing the last testament of a man who had discovered something so dangerous that it had cost him his life. Jake picked up Chen's journal again this time, with the grim understanding that he was not just reading the investigation notes of a dead journalist, but following a path that might very well lead to his own destruction. But as he looked at the raven coin glinting in the fading light, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since Syria. purpose. For the first time in 2 years, the ghosts of his fallen teammates had been given faces and names. The conspiracy that had killed them was still active, still claiming victims, and Jake Thompson was perhaps the only person left alive who could expose the truth and bring justice to those responsible. The war that had taken everything from him was not over. It had simply followed him home to the mountains of Virginia, and this time he intended to be the one left standing when the smoke cleared. Jake stared at the raven coin long into the night, its silver surface catching the flicker of lamplight from inside the cabin. Sleep eluded him as memories of Syria played on repeat in his mind, now viewed through the lens of Sheriff Kane's unexpected visit. The official story about insurgent chemical weapons had never made sense, but Jake had been too traumatized and too trusting of military intelligence to question it properly. Now holding physical evidence that connected his team's death to some kind of ongoing operation, the pieces were falling into a horrifying pattern. By dawn, Jake had made his decision. If Michael Chen had been investigating Darkwater Industries before his disappearance, then Chen's research might hold the key to understanding what had really happened in Syria and who was responsible. The journalist had mentioned hiding evidence at something called the Lightning Oak, and Jake intended to find it. But first he needed to understand more about the man whose property he now owned and whose investigation might have cost him his life. Jake spent the morning carefully photographing every page of Chen's journal, with his phone creating digital copies before the fragile paper could deteriorate further. The USB drive from the lockbox appeared damaged, but Jake had learned basic data recovery during his military service. Using his laptop and some specialized software he'd kept from his SEAL days, he began the painstaking process of trying to extract whatever information Chen had stored on the drive. While the recovery program ran, Jake studied the local county records he'd downloaded before moving to the mountains. What he found painted a troubling picture of Michael Chen's final months. According to official reports, Chen had purchased the property through a shell company, paying cash for the land, and immediately beginning extensive renovations on the cabin. But the renovation permits told a different story. Chen hadn't been improving the cabin for comfort. He'd been fortifying it. Building permits showed requests for reinforced doors, security lighting, and a basement addition that wasn't mentioned in any of the real estate listings Jake had seen. Most telling of all was a permit for what was described as a storm shelter, but Jake's military experience told him it was more likely a safe room or emergency bunker. Chen hadn't been planning to live in peaceful isolation. He'd been preparing for war. Storm's sudden alert snapped Jake from his research. The dog stood rigid at the front window, ears forward and hackles raised. Jake moved carefully to peer through the curtains and felt his blood chill. A dark SUV with tinted windows was parked on the access road about a quarter-mile down the mountain, positioned where it had a clear view of Jake's driveway but remained partially concealed by the tree line. Surveillance. Jake recognized the setup immediately from his own training in intelligence gathering. Someone was watching the cabin, probably had been since Kane's visit the night before. Jake moved away from the window without making any sudden movements that might alert the watchers that he'd spotted them. He needed information, and he needed it fast. The data recovery program chimed softly, indicating it had extracted some files from Chen's damaged USB drive. Jake's heart raced as he opened the recovered folders. What he found exceeded his worst fears. Chen had been methodical in his investigation, and his files contained photographs, audio recordings, and document scans that painted a picture of a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple environmental crimes. Darkwater Industries wasn't just illegally dumping chemical waste in the Virginia mountains. They were actively testing weaponized chemical compounds and using the remote location to conduct field trials of substances too dangerous or too illegal to test in traditional laboratory settings. The photographs showed unmarked trucks making nighttime deliveries to a facility hidden deep in the national forest, and the documents revealed that these compounds were being developed for military applications overseas. But it was the personnel files that made Jake's hands shake with rage. Darkwater had been recruiting test subjects from VA hospitals across 3 states, targeting veterans with severe PTSD who were isolated from family and friends. These men were offered experimental treatment programs that promised to cure their psychological wounds, but the real purpose was to test the effects of chemical weapons on human subjects who wouldn't be missed if they died or disappeared. Jake recognized several names from the files, including members of his own unit who had survived Syria only to disappear months later under suspicious circumstances. His team hadn't been randomly attacked in Syria. They had been selected as test subjects for whatever chemical weapon Darkwater was developing, and the attack had been carefully orchestrated to look like enemy action. The sound of footsteps on his porch made Jake freeze. Storm was already moving toward the door, his body language indicating multiple threats approaching. Jake quickly copied Chen's files to a secure cloud server, then grabbed his service pistol from his gear bag. Military training kicked in as he assessed his tactical situation. The cabin had only 2 exits, front and back, and he had no idea how many hostiles were positioned outside. A woman's voice called through the door, clear and professional but tinged with urgency. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Emma Chen. I'm Michael's sister. I need to talk to you about what you found." Jake hesitated, recognizing the name from some of Chen's personal notes, but unsure whether this was a genuine contact or an elaborate trap. The timing was too convenient, coming just hours after he'd discovered the surveillance team. "I'm alone," the voice continued. "I saw the county vehicle yesterday and the sedan that's been watching you since dawn. We need to compare notes before they make their move." The mention of the surveillance had confirmed that whoever this was had been observing the situation with professional attention to detail. Jake made his decision but kept his weapon ready as he approached the door. Through the peephole, he could see a woman in her late 20s with East Asian features and dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore sturdy hiking clothes and carried a large backpack that suggested she'd been camping or living rough. More importantly, she was alone, and her body language showed the kind of controlled alertness that Jake associated with military or law enforcement training. Jake opened the door but kept the chain engaged, creating a gap just wide enough for conversation. Storm positioned himself beside the door, ready to respond to any threat. Emma Chen looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and the pale complexion of someone who'd been living under extreme stress for an extended period. "Dr. Emma Chen," she said, showing him a medical ID badge. "I'm a retired Army medic and Michael's younger sister. I've been investigating his disappearance for the past year, and I know you found his lockbox because you've been accessing his cloud storage accounts." Her knowledge of his digital activities confirmed that she had sophisticated technical capabilities, possibly military-grade surveillance equipment. Jake studied her face, looking for signs of deception. Her eyes held the same intensity he'd seen in Chen's journal entries, and her hands showed calluses consistent with medical training and outdoor survival. More convincingly, Storm's reaction to her was curious rather than hostile. And Jake had learned to trust his companion's judgment about people's intentions. "Give me something that proves you are who you say you are," Jake demanded. Emma reached into her jacket, slowly telegraphing her movements to avoid triggering a defensive response. She produced a photograph of herself with a man who bore a strong family resemblance, standing in front of the cabin during what appeared to be summer weather. "That's Michael and me here last year, about 2 months before he disappeared. He was already paranoid by then, convinced that someone was monitoring his communications. He set up dead drops and coded messages, taught me how to access his research if something happened to him." She paused, glancing nervously toward the tree line where the surveillance vehicle was positioned. "I've been living in the national forest for 3 weeks, trying to piece together his final investigation. I know about Darkwater Industries, about the chemical weapons testing, about the veterans they've been using as subjects. And I know why they killed him." Jake released the chain and stepped back, allowing Emma to enter, while Storm maintained his alert posture. Inside the cabin, Emma immediately moved to the windows, checking sight lines and potential escape routes with the efficiency of someone accustomed to operating in hostile territory. She set her backpack on the table and began unpacking equipment that confirmed her military background. Night vision goggles, encrypted communication devices, and a tablet computer that appeared to be ruggedized for field operations. Michael discovered that Darkwater is a front company for something called Project Nightfall. Emma began activating her tablet to display a complex organizational chart. It's a joint military corporate venture that's been developing chemical weapons for the past 5 years using veterans as unwitting test subjects. The compounds they're creating are designed to be undetectable in standard autopsies, making them perfect for assassinations that need to look like natural causes. Jake felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Your brother found out about Syria, didn't he? About what happened to my team?" Emma nodded grimly, pulling up another file that showed photographs of military personnel, including Jake's service record and those of his fallen teammates. "Syria was one of their field tests. They wanted to see how their compounds performed against trained special operations personnel under combat conditions. Your team was specifically selected because you were isolated from other units and operating in an area where casualties could be explained by enemy action. The attack was launched by Darkwater assets embedded with Syrian government forces using chemical delivery systems that left no traceable evidence. The rage that Jake had been suppressing for 2 years finally found its target. His teammates hadn't died because of tactical errors or bad intelligence. They had been murdered by their own side, sacrificed for an illegal weapons development program that was still claiming victims. 4 of his closest friends and brothers-in-arms had died so that defense contractors could perfect tools of assassination for the highest bidder. Emma continued her briefing, showing Jake satellite photographs of the Darkwater facility hidden in the mountains about 20 miles from his property. The installation was much larger than Chen's notes had indicated, covering several square miles and including laboratory buildings, testing ranges, and what appeared to be detention facilities. Armed security personnel patrolled the perimeter, and the entire complex was surrounded by electromagnetic barriers that would prevent unauthorized communications or digital surveillance. But it was Emma's next revelation that transformed Jake's anger into cold determination. They've accelerated their timeline since you arrived. Intelligence intercepts indicate they're planning to eliminate all remaining witnesses within the next 72 hours. That includes the veterans they've been using as test subjects, the few researchers who've developed ethical concerns, and anyone who might have accessed Michael's research. Jake understood the implication immediately. His presence had triggered a cleanup operation, and everyone connected to the investigation was now marked for death. The surveillance team outside wasn't just watching him. They were waiting for orders to neutralize the threat he represented. "There's something else you need to know," Emma said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The head of security for the entire operation is someone you know, Marcus Williams, your old squad mate from Syria." Jake felt the world tilt sideways as another piece of the conspiracy clicked into place. "Marcus is alive." Jake's voice was barely audible, the shock and betrayal warring in his chest. Emma nodded grimly, pulling up a surveillance photograph that showed Marcus in tactical gear, clearly directing security for operations at the Darkwater facility. "He was the one who recommended this property to you, who made sure you'd find Michael's evidence. Marcus has been working for them since Syria, Jake. He was the inside man who provided your team's location for the chemical attack." Emma's words hit Jake like physical blows, each revelation more devastating than the last. The friend who had comforted him after the attack, who had helped him through his darkest moments of grief and survivor's guilt, had been the architect of his team's murder. Marcus had played the role of supportive brother-in-arms while working for the very people who had killed their teammates. "Why would he want me to find the evidence?" Jake asked, struggling to process the scope of Marcus's betrayal. Emma's expression hardened as she explained the final piece of the puzzle. "Because they need a fall guy. Someone to blame for the security breach, for Michael's investigation, for everything that's about to be exposed. Marcus guided you here so they could frame you as a rogue operator who went insane with grief and concocted an elaborate conspiracy theory. When they kill you, they'll plant evidence that makes you look like a domestic terrorist, discrediting any investigation into Project Nightfall." Emma's equipment detected the approach of additional vehicles before Jake's human senses registered the sound. Multiple engines moving fast up the mountain road with the coordination of a tactical team. She grabbed her gear and moved toward the back of the cabin while Jake collected his essential equipment and called Storm to his side. "We need to reach the Lightning Oak before they lock down the entire area," Emma said, pulling on a tactical vest that had been hidden in her pack. "Michael's final cache contains evidence that can expose the entire network, including the names of government officials who authorized Project Nightfall. Without that evidence, they'll cover this up just like they did Syria." Jake strapped on his own gear, muscle memory from countless military operations taking over despite the civilian setting. He'd found his enemy at last, but the revelation about Marcus had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of trust and loyalty. The man he'd considered his closest friend had orchestrated the deaths of their brothers in arms and was now preparing to frame Jake for crimes he'd never committed. The sound of vehicles reached the clearing just as Jake and Emma slipped out the cabin's back door into the dense forest beyond. Storm ranged ahead, his superior senses guiding them away from the approaching threat, while Jake's training allowed him to move silently through terrain that would challenge most civilians. Behind them, the peaceful sanctuary Jake had sought became a battleground, and the war that had claimed his brothers in arms finally followed him home to the mountains of Virginia. Through the trees, Jake could see muzzle flashes as the tactical team breached his cabin, searching for targets that were already melting into the wilderness like ghosts. Emma moved beside him with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in combat situations, and together they began the deadly game of cat and mouse that would determine whether the truth about Project Nightfall would ever see daylight. Deputy Maria Rodriguez was waiting for them in the forest. Jake's heart lurched as he recognized the uniform, immediately assuming they'd walked into an ambush. But Emma raised a hand, signaling that Rodriguez was an ally, not a threat. The deputy looked haggard, her usually pressed uniform wrinkled and stained with forest debris, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much. "I've been tracking the Darkwater operation for months," Rodriguez said quietly, keeping her voice low to avoid detection by the search teams now spreading through the forest. "My father was one of their test subjects, recruited from the VA hospital in Richmond with promises of revolutionary PTSD treatment. He died 3 weeks into the program. Official cause was heart failure, but I saw the autopsy photos. Chemical burns on his lungs that they said were from his old smoking habit." Rodriguez's revelation added another dimension to the conspiracy. Local law enforcement wasn't entirely compromised. At least one officer had been conducting her own investigation, risking her career and her life to uncover the truth about what was happening to veterans in her county. "Kane doesn't know I'm investigating," Rodriguez continued. "He thinks I'm just another small-town deputy who follows orders without asking questions. But I've been documenting everything. Vehicle movements, personnel, transfer supply deliveries. I know where they're holding the current test subjects, and I know when they're planning to eliminate them." The sound of tracking dogs reached them through the forest, still distant but growing closer. The search teams were being thorough and professional, using trained animals to follow scent trails through terrain that would otherwise provide perfect concealment. Jake realized they had perhaps 30 minutes before the pursuit would catch up to them. Rodriguez led them deeper into the forest, following paths that weren't marked on any official maps, but had been used by hunters and moonshiners for generations. Her knowledge of the local terrain was encyclopedic, and she moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent her entire life in these mountains. "The Lightning Oak is about 2 miles from here," she explained, as they moved through a particularly dense section of underbrush. "But there's a Darkwater patrol base between us and the tree. 6 men rotating shifts every 12 hours. They'll have night vision and thermal imaging, plus radio contact with the main facility." Jake assessed their tactical situation. 3 people, 1 dog, limited ammunition, and an unknown number of enemies with superior equipment and reinforcements. Under normal circumstances, he would recommend avoiding contact and finding an alternate route to their objective. But time was running out, and Emma had made it clear that delay would mean the destruction of evidence and the deaths of innocent people. "We go through them." Jake decided, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions under pressure. Rodriguez and Emma looked at him with surprise, perhaps expecting a more cautious approach from a veteran suffering from PTSD. "I've been running from this fight for 2 years, Jake explained, checking his weapon and adjusting his tactical vest. "My teammates died because I wasn't there to help them. I won't let more people die because I'm afraid to face the truth about what happened." Rodriguez nodded slowly, recognizing something in Jake's demeanor that suggested he was no longer the traumatized veteran who had arrived seeking peace. The patrol base was positioned on a ridge overlooking the approach to the Lightning Oak, a tactical placement that would make it difficult to bypass undetected. Jake studied the position through binoculars, noting the fields of fire and dead spaces that would provide concealment during an assault. The enemy had chosen their ground well, but they were dealing with defensive positions, which meant they were vulnerable to a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Emma proved her worth during the planning phase, her medical knowledge allowing her to identify weak points in the enemy's setup. Rodriguez's familiarity with local law enforcement procedures gave them insight into how the patrol would respond to different types of threats. And Storm's presence added an element of unpredictability that no enemy would anticipate or prepare for. The attack began at sunset, when changing light conditions would interfere with thermal imaging and create visual confusion for the defenders. Jake approached from the east, using Storm as a force multiplier to create chaos and confusion among the patrol. Emma and Rodriguez flanked from the north and south, their movements coordinated by hand signals and predetermined timing. The fight was brief but intense. Jake's military training proved decisive against enemies who were skilled but not accustomed to facing special operations personnel. Within minutes, the patrol base was neutralized, its occupants either unconscious or fleeing into the forest. More importantly, Jake had reclaimed something he'd lost in Syria. The confidence to act decisively in combat, the trust in his own abilities that trauma had shattered. As they moved toward the Lightning Oak, Jake realized that his search for peace had led him to exactly where he needed to be. The war wasn't over, but for the first time since Syria, he was fighting back against the people who had destroyed his life. Marcus Williams and the architects of Project Ironfall were about to discover that Jake Thompson was no longer a victim of their conspiracy. He was a weapon pointed directly at their hearts, and nothing would stop him from delivering justice for his fallen brothers. The Lightning Oak stood before them like a monument to nature's raw power, its massive trunk scarred by the jagged black wound where electricity had carved its mark decades ago. The ancient tree dominated a small clearing deep in the national forest, its canopy spreading wide enough to shelter a house. Even in the fading twilight, Jake could see why Michael Chen had chosen this location for his final cache. The tree was unmistakable, a landmark that would endure long after human structures crumbled to dust. Emma approached the base of the oak with reverence, running her hands over the gnarled root system that spread out like tentacles from the massive trunk. Michael taught me the pattern, she said quietly, her fingers tracing specific roots in a sequence that appeared random but clearly held meaning. He was always paranoid about security even as kids, had secret hiding places for everything that mattered to him. Jake maintained security while Emma worked, storm positioned to alert them to any approaching threats. The destruction of the patrol base would buy them time, but not much. Darkwater would respond with overwhelming force once they realized their perimeter had been breached, and Jake had no illusions about their ability to hold off a full tactical response with their limited resources. Rodriguez monitored radio frequencies, listening to the increasingly frantic communications between Darkwater security teams. They're pulling personnel from the main facility, she reported. Marcus Williams is personally leading a search team, and they're bringing military-grade equipment. Helicopter support, thermal imaging in the works. The mention of Marcus sent another wave of betrayal through Jake's chest, but he pushed the emotion aside to focus on the immediate tactical situation. Found it, Emma announced, her voice tight with excitement and relief. A section of the root system had shifted aside to reveal a concealed cavity expertly camouflaged to blend with the natural contours of the tree. Inside the hollow space, wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof material, was a military-grade communications device and several sealed containers that appeared to contain documents and digital storage media. Emma carefully extracted the cache while Jake continued to scan their surroundings for threats. The first container held photographs that made Jake's blood run cold. Clear surveillance images of Project Nightfall facilities in 3 different countries showing chemical weapons testing on human subjects who appeared to be prisoners or unwilling participants. The scale of the operation was far larger than even Emma had suspected, with installations in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Central America conducting parallel research programs. The second container contained the evidence capable of bringing down the entire conspiracy. Financial records showing payments from the U.S. Department of Defense to shell companies controlled by Darkwater Industries, with specific line items for chemical weapons development and human testing programs. Congressional authorization documents signed by ranking members of military oversight committees approving black budget funding for projects that officially didn't exist. Most damning of all were communication intercepts between high-ranking military officials and Darkwater executives discussing the Syria operation that had killed Jake's team. The conversations were clinical in their callousness, treating the deaths of American servicemen as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of weapons development goals. Jake recognized several names from his own chain of command officers he had respected and trusted, who had known exactly what was going to happen to his team. Storm's sudden alertness interrupted their examination of the evidence. The dog's ears were forward, his body tense as he focused on something moving through the forest toward their position. Jake signaled for silence, drawing his weapon as the sound of footsteps became audible through the underbrush. Multiple contacts moving with tactical precision rather than the random pattern of lost hikers or wildlife. Rodriguez positioned herself behind a fallen log, her service weapon trained on the tree line where the approaching figures would emerge. Emma secured the evidence containers in her pack, preparing for immediate movement if their position became untenable. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the quiet electronic beeping of military-grade communication equipment. A figure emerged from the forest shadows, hands raised to show he was unarmed, but moving with the confident ease of someone who knew he held all the advantages. Marcus Williams stepped into the clearing, and Jake felt time compress as he faced the man who had orchestrated his team's murder in Syria. Marcus looked exactly as Jake remembered, tall and lean, with the bearing of a career special operations soldier, but his eyes now held a coldness that Jake had never seen during their years of brotherhood. "Hello, Jake," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth Jake remembered from their friendship. "You've led us quite a chase through these mountains. I have to admit I'm impressed. 2 years ago, you could barely function without medication. Now you're conducting tactical operations like the old days." Jake kept his weapon trained on Marcus while fighting to control the rage that threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking. "Why, Marcus? Why kill our own people? Why betray everything we swore to protect?" Marcus's smile was sad and tired, the expression of someone who had made peace with choices that others would never understand. "You think I wanted this, Jake? You think I planned to watch Rodriguez and Martinez and Johnson die in that Syrian valley?" Marcus moved closer, seemingly unconcerned about the weapons pointed at him. "I was recruited by Darkwater after our second tour. They showed me classified intelligence about chemical weapons programs being developed by hostile nations. Convinced me that Project Nightfall was necessary to protect American lives." Rodriguez kept her weapon steady, but Jake could see her hands trembling with the effort of not pulling the trigger. This man had ordered the deaths of countless veterans, had turned medical treatment programs into death sentences for men and women who had already sacrificed everything for their country. By the time I realized what they were really doing, I was in too deep to back out. Marcus continued, his voice taking on a pleading quality that Jake found disgusting. "They had documentation of my involvement, evidence that would have destroyed my career and sent me to prison for life. They owned me, Jake, just like they own half the Pentagon and most of the congressional oversight committees." Emma spoke for the first time since Marcus's arrival, her voice cold with professional assessment. "You're trying to justify mass murder by claiming you were a victim. How many veterans died because of your cooperation? How many families were destroyed so you could protect your career and reputation?" Marcus's facade of regret cracked slightly, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "More than I wanted, fewer than would have died if hostile nations had developed these weapons first. Project Nightfall has given us capabilities that have prevented international conflicts you can't even imagine. The greater good sometimes requires terrible sacrifices." Jake recognized the rhetoric from his own military training, the utilitarian logic that reduced human lives to statistical probabilities and acceptable losses. But hearing it applied to American servicemen, to his own brothers in arms, filled him with a fury that threatened to override his tactical discipline. "You murdered Rodriguez in his sleep," Jake said, his voice barely controlled. "Watched him choke on his own blood while you took notes on symptom progression. Martinez died calling for his mother because the chemical burns were eating through his lungs. And you stood there documenting it all like a fucking scientist studying lab rats." Marcus flinched at Jake's description, the first genuine emotion he had shown since entering the clearing. "Those deaths weren't supposed to happen that way," he said defensively. "The compound was supposed to be fast-acting, essentially painless. The suffering was an unintended side effect that we've since corrected in later formulations. The clinical language was more damning than any admission of guilt could have been." Marcus had become so indoctrinated into the conspiracy's mindset that he spoke about the torture deaths of their teammates as technical problems to be solved, rather than war crimes that had destroyed lives and families. Rodriguez's radio crackled with incoming communications from her department. "Officer Rodriguez, respond immediately. We have reports of shots fired at your location. Are you in need of assistance?" Rodriguez looked at Jake with understanding, recognizing that her cover was about to be blown and her usefulness as an inside source was ending. "I'm sorry," Jake, Rodriguez said quietly, keying her radio. "This is Rodriguez. I'm in custody with the suspects. They're armed and have threatened to kill hostages if federal agents move on their position. Do not approach without further contact." Marcus smiled with genuine approval. "Very good, Deputy. You've bought us some time to resolve this situation without unnecessary bloodshed." Jake realized that Rodriguez had just sacrificed her career and possibly her freedom to give them a tactical advantage, but her deception would only work for a limited time before her department demanded proof of life or direct communication. Emma had been moving slowly during the conversation, positioning herself for a flanking maneuver that would give them options if negotiations broke down. Storm remained focused on Marcus the dog's predatory stillness, indicating that he was prepared to attack on command. Jake weighed their tactical situation, calculating odds and contingencies with a methodical precision that had kept him alive through countless combat operations. "You want the evidence?" Jake said, not really asking a question. Marcus nodded, glancing at Emma's pack where the containers from Michael Chen's cache were secured. "That evidence represents years of careful intelligence gathering and operational planning. In the wrong hands, it could destabilize international relationships and compromise ongoing national security operations." "And what about the veterans who are still being used as test subjects?" Emma demanded. "The men and women who trusted their government to provide medical care and instead became unwilling participants in illegal weapons development." Marcus's expression hardened, showing the first glimpse of the ruthless operator he had become. "Acceptable casualties in a larger conflict," he replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "Every military operation involves risk to personnel." These volunteers understood they were participating in experimental treatment programs that might not succeed. Their sacrifice serves the greater strategic interests of national defense. Jake felt something break inside him at Marcus's words, the final severing of bonds that had once made them brothers. The man standing before him was no longer the teammate who had saved his life in Kandahar and shared his grief after difficult missions. Marcus had become something else entirely, a creature who could justify any atrocity in service of abstract strategic goals. Rodriguez made her move while Jake was processing his emotional response to Marcus's betrayal. She lunged forward, grabbing for Marcus's concealed sidearm while shouting for Jake and Emma to run. The deputy's sacrifice was both brave and futile, as Marcus was far more experienced in close-quarters combat and had been expecting some form of desperate action. The struggle was brief but decisive. Marcus disarmed Rodriguez with professional efficiency, but not before she managed to trigger a small explosive device that she had concealed in her tactical vest. The blast was designed to create confusion rather than casualties, filling the clearing with smoke and debris while temporarily disorienting everyone present. Rodriguez's final words were lost in the explosion, but Jake saw her mouth the word "run" before Marcus's return fire cut her down. The deputy collapsed beside the lightning oak, her blood soaking into the ancient roots, while her sacrifice created the distraction that Jake and Emma needed to escape into the forest. Jake grabbed Emma's hand and plunged into the underbrush, Storm racing ahead to scout their escape route, while the smoke from Rodriguez's device provided concealment from Marcus's backup team. Behind them, Jake could hear Marcus shouting orders to his men, coordinating pursuit through the forest with professional competence that made their situation even more desperate. As they fled through the darkness, Jake realized that Rodriguez's death had fundamentally changed the nature of their mission. They were no longer simply trying to expose a conspiracy or rescue innocent victims. They were carrying the testimony of a woman who had died trying to protect the truth, and her sacrifice demanded that they succeed regardless of personal cost. Emma moved beside him with the determination of someone who understood that failure would mean Rodriguez's death had been meaningless. Storm guided them through terrain that would challenge their pursuers, while Jake's military training allowed him to maintain pace despite the emotional trauma of watching another ally die for the cause they had all embraced. The evidence from Michael Chen's cache felt heavier in Emma's pack as they ran weighted not just with the physical materials, but with the responsibility of ensuring that the truth about Project Nightfall reached people who could act on it. Jake knew that Marcus would pursue them with all the resources at his disposal, but for the first time since Syria, Jake felt the clear purpose that came with absolute commitment to a mission. Rodriguez had died to give them a chance to expose the conspiracy that had murdered so many veterans. Jake intended to honor her sacrifice by ensuring that Marcus Williams and everyone involved in Project Nightfall faced justice for their crimes. The war that had started in Syria was entering its final phase, and Jake was no longer running from the truth about what had happened to his team. He was carrying it toward the light, no matter who tried to stop him. The sound of pursuing helicopters reached them through the forest canopy as Darkwater mobilized its full resources to prevent the evidence from reaching federal authorities. Jake smiled grimly as he recognized the familiar sensation of being hunted by superior forces in hostile territory. This was exactly the kind of asymmetric warfare he had trained for throughout his military career. Marcus Marcus Williams was about to discover that hunting a Navy SEAL through mountain terrain was considerably more difficult than murdering unsuspecting veterans in controlled laboratory settings. The predator was about to become the prey, and Jake intended to make the experience as educational as possible before it ended. The lightning oak disappeared behind them as they ran deeper into the wilderness, but Rodriguez's blood remained on its roots as testimony to the price that good people paid when they chose to stand against evil. Her sacrifice would not be forgotten, and her death would not go unavenged. Jake Thompson was going to war one final time, and this battle would determine whether the truth about Project Nightfall died with them in these mountains or survived to bring justice to the men and women who had already paid the ultimate price for their government's betrayal. The forest closed around them like a protective embrace as they ran toward an uncertain future carrying secrets that could topple governments and expose crimes that reached the highest levels of military and political power. Behind them, Marcus Williams continued his pursuit, unaware that he was chasing two people who no longer had anything left to lose and everything left to fight for. The war was far from over, but for the first time since Syria, Jake knew exactly which side he was fighting for and what victory would look like when the smoke finally cleared. The abandoned mine shaft offered temporary sanctuary from the helicopter searchlights that swept the forest canopy above them. Jake and Emma had been running for 3 hours through terrain that would have challenged experienced hikers in daylight, but Storm's superior night vision and Jake's military navigation skills had brought them to this forgotten relic of Virginia's industrial past. The mine entrance was concealed behind decades of vegetation growth, invisible to aerial reconnaissance and thermal imaging. Emma collapsed against the rough stone wall of the tunnel, her breathing ragged from the sustained flight through hostile territory. Rodriguez's sacrifice had bought them time and distance, but Jake knew that Marcus would expand his search parameters systematically until he located their position. The mine complex might hide them from immediate detection, but it also represented a potential trap if Darkwater forces discovered their location. Storm ranged ahead into the mine tunnels, his enhanced senses detecting air currents and structural stability that would determine whether deeper penetration was safe. Jake used the momentary respite to assess their tactical situation with the cold objectivity that had kept him alive through countless combat operations. They possessed evidence that could expose Project Nightfall, but they were isolated in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no reliable communication with potential allies. Emma activated a small LED headlamp and began examining the evidence containers they had recovered from Michael Chen's cache. The financial records and communication intercepts painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond Darkwater Industries, implicating congressional oversight committees, Pentagon procurement officials, and intelligence agencies that had provided operational support for the illegal weapons development program. "This goes all the way to the top," Emma said quietly, her voice echoing strangely in the confines of the tunnel. Michael documented payments to senators who authorized black budget funding Defense Department officials, who falsified safety reports, and CIA operatives who provided cover for international testing operations. Project Nightfall isn't just a rogue military contractor. It's a joint venture between corporate interests and government agencies that have been operating outside legal oversight for years. Jake studied the documents over Emma's shoulder, recognizing names and signatures from his own military career. Officers who had briefed his unit before deployment, intelligence analysts who had provided mission planning support, logistics coordinators who had arranged transportation and equipment. The conspiracy had tentacles throughout the military and intelligence establishments, which explained how they had been able to orchestrate the Syria attack with such precision and maintain operational security afterward. The sound of approaching vehicles reached them through the mine entrance, still distant, but moving methodically through the forest road network that provided access to the abandoned mining areas. Jake estimated they had perhaps 30 minutes before Darkwater search teams reached their immediate vicinity, and the mine complex offered limited options for concealment or escape if their position was discovered. Emma's satellite communicator chimed with an incoming message that she read with growing alarm. "Federal support teams have been recalled," she announced grimly. "Someone with executive-level authority has classified Project Nightfall as a matter of national security, prohibiting law enforcement agencies from investigating without specific congressional authorization. We're officially on our own. Jake felt the familiar sensation of a mission being compromised by political considerations beyond the control of operational personnel. The evidence they carried was apparently too dangerous for normal law enforcement channels, which meant that traditional methods of exposure would be blocked by the same government officials who had authorized the illegal weapons program in the first place. Storm's return from the deeper tunnels was accompanied by a low whine that indicated distress or warning. The dog's body language suggested that he had detected something in the mine complex that posed a significant threat, possibly structural instability, or the presence of dangerous gases that accumulated in abandoned underground workings. "We need to move," Jake decided, recognizing that their current position offered neither security nor tactical advantage. The mine complex had seemed like sanctuary, but it was actually a dead end that would trap them if Marcus's forces discovered their location. They needed to return to the surface and find a position that offered options for maneuver and communication with potential allies. As they prepared to leave the mine entrance, Emma's equipment detected multiple heat signatures approaching through the forest from 3 different directions. Darkwater had deployed sufficient personnel to conduct a thorough search of the area using thermal imaging and coordinated movement patterns that would make evasion extremely difficult in the remaining hours of darkness. Jake made the tactical decision that would define the remainder of their mission. Instead of continuing to run from their pursuers, they would take the initiative and conduct offensive operations designed to disrupt Darkwater's search efforts while creating opportunities to transmit the evidence to media outlets or congressional investigators who might act on the information. Emma understood immediately what Jake was proposing, and her medical training allowed her to assess the physical and psychological demands of transitioning from evasion to direct action. "They're expecting us to keep running," she said with growing conviction. "A preemptive strike might give us the operational surprise we need to break out of their containment zone." Storm's military training made him an ideal asset for the type of asymmetric warfare that Jake was planning. The dog could move silently through terrain that would challenge human operators, gathering intelligence and creating diversions that would allow Jake and Emma to engage targets from unexpected angles. More importantly, Storm's presence would multiply their effective combat power in ways that Darkwater security personnel would not anticipate or prepare for. The first Darkwater patrol entered their engagement zone at dawn, moving with tactical precision but insufficient caution for the type of opposition they were about to face. Jake had positioned himself in an overwatch position that provided clear fields of fire, while Emma established a support position that would allow her to provide medical aid and communication support as needed. Storm initiated the contact by attacking the patrol's point man from a concealed position, using his training to disable rather than kill, while creating the confusion necessary for Jake's follow-up assault. The engagement was brief and decisive, with Jake's superior training and preparation overwhelming security personnel who were skilled but not accustomed to facing special operations forces in terrain that favored defenders. The captured radio equipment provided immediate intelligence about Darkwater's operational plans and force disposition. Marcus had deployed 3 separate search teams with helicopter support and communications intercept capabilities, but he had apparently underestimated the tactical competence of his targets. The radio traffic revealed growing frustration among the search teams and increasingly desperate measures being authorized by the operational command. Emma monitored federal law enforcement frequencies, while Jake prepared captured equipment for their next phase of operations. Local FBI and ATF offices had received orders to avoid the operational area, officially due to ongoing national security operations that required military rather than civilian law enforcement response. The political protection that Project Nightfall enjoyed was comprehensive and reached agency levels that could override normal investigative procedures. But Emma had retained contact with investigative journalists who specialized in defense industry corruption and military accountability issues. Her brother Michael had developed relationships with reporters who understood the complexity of exposing classified programs and had the professional courage to publish stories that would attract retaliation from powerful interests. The satellite communicator allowed Emma to establish secure contact with Sarah Martinez, an investigative journalist at the Washington Post, who had been following defense contractor irregularities for several years. Emma transmitted selected portions of Michael's evidence, while Jake maintained security and monitored Darkwater communications for signs of their next tactical movement. Martinez confirmed receipt of the initial evidence package and promised to begin verification procedures immediately, but she warned that publication would require additional corroborating sources and legal review that might take weeks to complete. Emma emphasized that they might not survive that long and requested immediate contact with congressional oversight committees that had statutory authority to investigate defense industry crimes. The journalist's response was discouraging. Several committee members were specifically named in Michael's evidence as recipients of Darkwater payments, which meant that normal congressional oversight mechanisms were compromised. Martinez suggested contact with international human rights organizations that might have jurisdiction over chemical weapons violations, but those investigations would take months to develop and lacked enforcement capabilities within U.S. territory. Jake realized that traditional exposure methods would be insufficient to stop Project Nightfall in the time frame necessary to prevent additional casualties. The conspiracy had been constructed specifically to resist normal law enforcement and oversight mechanisms, which meant that unconventional approaches would be required to achieve their objectives. Storm's alert indicated approaching aircraft, likely the helicopter support that Marcus had mentioned in his earlier radio communications. Jake assessed their tactical situation and concluded that remaining in their current position would result in detection and elimination within minutes. They needed to relocate to terrain that would provide better concealment while maintaining their ability to transmit evidence to external contacts. Emma suggested a bold alternative that would expose them to significant risk, but might provide the breakthrough they needed to achieve their mission objectives. The Darkwater facility itself would contain additional evidence and possibly surviving test subjects who could provide first-hand testimony about the illegal weapons program. A direct assault on the installation would be tactically challenging, but might yield results that no amount of documentary evidence could provide. Jake considered the proposal with the analytical mind of a professional warrior evaluating mission parameters. The facility would be heavily defended and designed to resist exactly the type of infiltration they were contemplating. But Marcus would not expect them to attack his stronghold directly, especially with their limited personnel and equipment. The audacity of the plan might provide the tactical surprise necessary to penetrate security measures that were configured to prevent escape rather than infiltration. More importantly, Jake recognized that Rodriguez's sacrifice demanded results that could only be achieved through direct action rather than passive evidence gathering. The deputy had died to give them operational opportunities, and those opportunities needed to be exploited before Darkwater forces eliminated them or destroyed the proof of their crimes. Emma began planning their approach to the facility using satellite imagery and intelligence gathered from captured radio equipment. The installation was larger than Michael's original notes had indicated, covering several square miles of heavily wooded terrain with multiple laboratory buildings, detention facilities, and administrative structures. Security appeared to be concentrated around the perimeter and main access routes, but the facility's size might provide infiltration opportunities for operators willing to accept significant risk. Storm would be crucial for the operation, his superior senses allowing them to navigate security measures that would detect human intruders. The dog's military training included building clearance and personnel detection skills that would be invaluable for locating test subjects and avoiding enemy personnel during their penetration of the facility. Jake felt the familiar anticipation that preceded high-risk operations, the heightened awareness and tactical focus that had sustained him through the most dangerous missions of his military career. This would be their final opportunity to expose Project Nightfall and achieve justice for the veterans who had died in Darkwater's illegal experiments. Success would require every skill he had developed as a Navy SEAL, but failure would mean that Rodriguez's sacrifice and Michael Chen's investigation had been meaningless. As they prepared to leave their concealment and begin the approach to the Darkwater facility, Jake realized that his journey to these mountains had been leading inevitably toward this confrontation. The conspiracy that had destroyed his life and murdered his teammates was about to face the full capabilities of a special operations warrior who no longer had anything left to lose and everything left to fight for. Emma secured the evidence containers in her pack while Jake performed final equipment checks on their captured weapons and communications gear. Storm ranged ahead to scout their initial approach route, his predatory focus indicating that he understood the importance of the mission they were undertaking. The sun was rising through the forest canopy as they began their movement toward the Darkwater installation, but Jake felt the cold clarity that came with absolute commitment to a combat mission. Marcus Williams and his conspirators, were about to discover that murdering American veterans had consequences that reached far beyond their ability to control or contain. The facility appeared in the distance through gaps in the tree line, a sprawling complex of modern buildings surrounded by security fencing that looked more like a military installation than a civilian research center. Jake could see patrol vehicles moving along internal roads and security personnel manning checkpoint positions that would challenge any conventional approach to the target area. But Jake Thompson was no conventional threat. He was a Navy SEAL conducting a direct action mission against enemies who had declared war on everything he had sworn to protect. The battle for Project Nightfall was about to begin, and this time Jake intended to be the one left standing when the shooting stopped. Storm pressed against his leg in silent support as they moved into position for the final phase of their mission. Rodriguez's blood on the lightning oak would be avenged. Michael Chen's investigation would be vindicated, and the veterans who had died in Darkwater's laboratories would finally receive the justice they deserved. The war that had followed Jake home from Syria was about to end exactly where it should have ended from the beginning, in victory for the warriors who fought for truth and justice, and defeat for the predators who had betrayed everything that honor and service represented. Marcus Williams was about to learn that some battles could never be won through treachery and corruption. Some fights could only be settled by warriors willing to sacrifice everything for principles that no amount of money or political influence could purchase. The Darkwater facility waited ahead, unaware that death was approaching through the morning forest in the form of a man and Hitun who had finally found something worth dying for and the skills necessary to ensure their enemies died first. The Darkwater facility sprawled before them in the gray dawn light, a complex of steel and concrete that looked more like a military installation than a research center. Jake counted at least 12 buildings within the outer perimeter fence, connected by covered walkways that would provide concealment for defensive personnel. Guard towers positioned at strategic intervals gave security teams overlapping fields of fire across the entire compound. Emma activated her tablet to display the facility schematics they had recovered from Michael's cache, comparing the blueprints with what they could observe from their concealment position. The main laboratory building housed the administrative offices and primary research facilities, while a separate detention complex held what appeared to be living quarters for test subjects. A third structure, partially underground, was labeled simply as special projects and showed no windows or standard architectural features. Storm's enhanced senses detected chemical odors that human noses couldn't register, industrial compounds and medical waste that suggested active experimentation was ongoing within the facility. The dog's body language indicated distress at the sense, possibly recognizing traces of the same chemicals that had been used against Jake's team in Syria. Jake studied the security patterns through binoculars, noting shift changes and patrol routes that would create brief windows of opportunity for infiltration. The facility operated on a 12-hour rotation schedule, with guards being replaced at dawn and dusk in a carefully choreographed process that temporarily reduced coverage in specific sectors. "We need to reach the Special Projects building," Emma said quietly, pointing to the partially underground structure. "That's where they'll be conducting the most sensitive experiments, and it's where they'd hold any prisoners who could provide testimony about the illegal weapons program." Jake nodded, recognizing the tactical challenges posed by a hardened target that was specifically designed to resist exactly the type of operation they were planning. The approach would require them to penetrate multiple security barriers while avoiding detection by thermal imaging systems and roving patrols. Once inside the facility, they would need to locate and extract any surviving test subjects while gathering additional evidence that could corroborate Michael's documentation. All of this had to be accomplished before reinforcements arrived that would make escape impossible. As they prepared to begin their infiltration, Jake's encrypted phone received an unexpected message from a number he didn't recognize. The text was brief but electrifying. "Jake, this is Wilson, FBI undercover inside Darkwater for 18 months. Marcus is not your enemy. Project Nightfall has been compromised by foreign intelligence. Meet me at Building 7 maintenance entrance in 20 minutes. Come alone. Jake stared at the message, his mind reeling, as another piece of the conspiracy clicked into place. Agent Wilson had been mentioned in some of Michael's notes as a potential federal contact, but Jake had assumed the reference was to a standard FBI liaison rather than a deep-cover operative embedded within the Darkwater organization itself. Emma read the message over Jake's shoulder, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding as she processed the implications. If Wilson is telling the truth, then everything we've assumed about the situation might be wrong. Marcus might be working for federal authorities trying to expose Project Nightfall from within. But it could also be an elaborate trap designed to separate us and eliminate the threat we represent. Jake weighed the tactical situation with the analytical mind of a professional operator. The message could be legitimate intelligence from a federal asset, or it could be a deception operation designed to lure them into a kill zone where they could be eliminated without witnesses. Either way, they needed more information before committing to a course of action that would determine whether their mission succeeded or failed. I'm going to the meeting, Jake decided. You stay here with Storm and maintain overwatch. If this is a trap, extract with the evidence and get it to your journalist contact. If Wilson is legitimate, we might be able to coordinate our efforts and achieve our objectives with federal support. Emma understood the logic but clearly didn't like the plan that separated their limited forces in hostile territory. Give me 30 minutes, she said finally. If you haven't made contact by then, I'm coming in after you. Jake nodded, knowing that Emma would follow through on her promise regardless of personal risk. Jake's approach to Building 7 required him to cross 200 meters of open ground that was covered by security cameras and motion sensors. He timed his movement to coincide with the shift change that created a brief gap in patrol coverage, using techniques learned during countless infiltration missions to remain invisible to electronic surveillance systems. Agent Wilson emerged from the building exactly on time, and Jake immediately recognized him as someone he had seen during his earlier reconnaissance of the facility. Wilson was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to operating in dangerous environments. More importantly, his movements and situational awareness suggested extensive training in covert operations. Jake Thompson Wilson said, quietly approaching with his hands visible, but maintaining the alert posture of someone ready for immediate action. I've been trying to make contact since you arrived in the area, but communication security made direct approach impossible until now. Jake kept his weapon ready, but allowed Wilson to close within conversation distance. Prove you're who you say you are, Jake demanded. Wilson reached slowly into his jacket and produced federal credentials that appeared genuine, along with a photograph that showed him with several people Jake recognized from intelligence briefings during his military service. I've been embedded with Darkwater for 18 months. Wilson explained, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been living under deep cover for an extended period. The Bureau suspected that Project Nightfall was compromised by foreign intelligence services, but we needed someone inside the organization to identify the extent of the penetration. Marcus Williams is my FBI contact. Wilson continued. He's been feeding information to the Bureau while maintaining his cover as head of security. What happened at the Lightning Oak was necessary to maintain his cover. He couldn't reveal his true allegiance without compromising the entire federal investigation. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow, fundamentally altering his understanding of everything that had happened since he arrived in the mountains. Marcus hadn't betrayed his team for money or career advancement. He had been trying to expose the same conspiracy that Jake was fighting, but from within the organization that had murdered American servicemen. The confrontation in the Forrest Rodriguez's death, all of it had been theater to protect Marcus's FBI cover. Wilson led Jake through a maintenance corridor that provided access to the interior of the facility without triggering security alarms. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with multiple underground levels that housed research laboratories and detention facilities. The construction was military-grade, designed to contain both personnel and hazardous materials that might be released during experimental procedures. They reached a security station where Wilson accessed computer terminals using administrative codes that confirmed his inside knowledge of facility operations. The screens showed real-time surveillance of various areas within the complex, including detention cells where Jake could see figures that appeared to be prisoners or test subjects. Marcus is being held in the Special Projects building, Wilson said grimly. They discovered his FBI connection 3 hours ago and are using him as a final test subject. The compound that killed your team in Syria is being administered in increasing doses while they document the effects on someone with his physical conditioning and training. Jake's tactical mind immediately began calculating the resources and timing necessary to rescue Marcus and the other prisoners while extracting the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. Emma's voice reached them through Jake's radio, urgent with warning. Multiple vehicles approaching the facility from the main road. Heavy security presence, looks like VIP convoy. Wilson cursed under his breath as he accessed additional surveillance feeds. That's Colonel Hayes arriving for the final phase. He's the Pentagon liaison who's been coordinating Project Nightfall from the military side. Once he takes direct control, they'll eliminate all evidence and witnesses before federal agencies can intervene. But as they watched the convoy enter the facility, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Sheriff Kane was in the lead vehicle, apparently providing local law enforcement coordination for whatever Hayes was planning. The sheriff, who had threatened Jake on his first day in the mountains, was working directly with the conspiracy's military leadership. "We need to move now," Jake said, already planning the coordinated assault that would rescue the prisoners and prevent the destruction of evidence. But as they prepared to begin their infiltration, the facility's communication systems crackled with an announcement that changed everything. "Attention all personnel. Lockdown protocol is now in effect. Facility sterilization will commence in 60 minutes. All non-essential staff report to designated safe areas immediately." This was followed by the mechanical hum of ventilation systems being sealed and the distinctive sound of blast doors closing throughout the complex. Wilson's face went pale as he realized what Hayes was implementing. "They're not just eliminating witnesses," he said in horror. "They're going to release weaponized Nightfall compound through the ventilation system of the entire facility. Everyone inside will die, and the deaths will be blamed on an industrial accident involving toxic chemicals." Jake understood immediately that this was the global threat they needed to prevent. The facility housed enough weaponized chemical agents to contaminate the entire valley, affecting civilian populations for miles downwind. Hayes wasn't just covering up Project Nightfall. He was conducting a field test that would kill thousands of innocent Americans while providing data on mass deployment of chemical weapons. "Emma, we have a new priority," Jake transmitted through his radio. "They're planning to release chemical weapons that will kill everyone in the valley. You need to evacuate immediately while I stop the deployment from inside the facility." But Emma's response was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from her position. Jake could hear automatic weapons and explosions that indicated she was under attack by security forces who had located their overwatch position. Storm's barking was audible through the radio, suggesting that the dog was defending Emma against multiple attackers. Wilson led Jake deeper into the facility as they raced against time to prevent mass casualties while rescuing Marcus and the other prisoners. The corridors were filled with facility personnel evacuating to safe areas, creating confusion that provided some concealment for their movement, but also indicated how serious Hayes was about implementing the sterilization protocol. They reached the Special Projects building just as Sheriff Kane was entering the detention area, apparently to personally oversee the elimination of witnesses before the chemical weapons release. Jake could see Marcus through security cameras, barely conscious, but alive, strapped to a hospital bed, while medical equipment monitored his vital signs. Kane was speaking into a radio, coordinating with Colonel Hayes about timing and deployment procedures. The sheriff's voice carried clearly through the surveillance audio as he confirmed the readiness of local law enforcement to contain the area after the chemical release and blamed the incident on industrial negligence. But as Jake watched, Kane's expression changed to one of horror as Hayes explained the full scope of the sterilization protocol. The sheriff had apparently believed he was participating in a limited cover-up operation, not mass murder, that would kill civilian populations throughout the valley. "This is insane," Kane said into his radio, his voice shaking with shock and disbelief. "You're talking about killing thousands of innocent people, including children and families who have nothing to do with Project Nightfall. I won't be part of genocide, Hayes." Hayes's response was cold and professional, informing Kane that the operation had been authorized at the highest levels of government as a necessary sacrifice to protect national security interests. The sheriff's cooperation was no longer requested but demanded, and his local knowledge would be essential for managing the aftermath and maintaining the cover story. Kane's face went through a series of expressions as he processed the magnitude of what Hayes was demanding. Jake could see the moment when the corrupt sheriff realized that he had been manipulated into becoming an accessory to mass murder, and that his choice now was between becoming a willing participant in genocide or dying as another victim of Hayes's operation. The sheriff made his decision with the kind of moral clarity that Jake hadn't expected from someone who had been taking bribes and covering up murders for years. Kane drew his sidearm and began moving toward the facility's command center where Hayes was coordinating the chemical weapons deployment. Wilson recognized what was happening and quickly accessed the facility's internal communications to monitor Kane's radio transmissions. The sheriff was trying to reach federal authorities and warn them about the impending attack, but Hayes had blocked all external communications and was jamming local emergency frequencies to prevent interference. Jake realized that Kane's rebellion against Hayes provided them with an unexpected ally and a potential distraction that could help them accomplish their rescue mission. But they needed to act immediately before Hayes realized that his local law enforcement coordinator had turned against the operation and taken steps to eliminate the threat. Wilson led Jake toward the detention area while Kane confronted Hayes in the command center. The corridors were filled with the sound of alarms and automated announcements counting down the time remaining before chemical deployment. 37 minutes until facility sterilization. All personnel must be in designated safe areas within 30 minutes. They found Marcus in a medical facility adjacent to the detention cells, barely conscious, but responsive enough to recognize Jake when he entered the room. The intravenous lines connected to his arms were delivering a cocktail of experimental compounds, but Wilson's medical knowledge allowed him to safely disconnect the equipment and administer basic first aid. Jake Marcus whispered, his voice weak but filled with relief. "I thought you were dead. The Syria attack, they told me you didn't make it out." Jake felt tears in his eyes as he helped his friend sit up, realizing that Marcus had been living with the same survivor's guilt that had tormented Jake for the past 2 years. "I've been trying to expose them from the inside," Marcus continued, his strength slowly returning as the drugs cleared from his system. "Project Nightfall killed our team, but it wasn't foreign intelligence like Wilson told you. It was Hayes and his Pentagon sponsors using us as test subjects to perfect their chemical weapons." Wilson looked stricken as he realized his error. "The intelligence I received was deliberately falsified," he said in horror. "Hayes fed me disinformation to protect the real conspiracy while making me think I was fighting foreign assets. We've all been manipulated by the same people we were trying to expose." The sound of Kane's confrontation with Hayes reached them through the facility's communication system broadcast over internal speakers as the sheriff tried to convince military personnel to abandon the chemical deployment and surrender to federal authorities. But Hayes had anticipated potential betrayal and was prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened the operation's security. Jake heard gunshots from the command center, followed by Kane's voice over the radio, weaker now, but still determined. "Federal agencies are en route. The chemical deployment will be blamed on you personally," Hayes not attributed to industrial accident. "Your cover story is blown." Hayes's response was to accelerate the deployment timeline, announcing that facility sterilization would commence in 15 minutes, rather than the originally planned hour. Emergency alarms began blaring throughout the complex as automated systems prepared to release chemical agents that would kill everyone who hadn't reached the underground safe areas. Jake realized they had minutes, not hours, to rescue the remaining prisoners and escape the facility before it became a death trap. The detention area held 12 veterans who were too weak from experimental procedures to evacuate without assistance, and Marcus was barely strong enough to walk without support. Wilson produced breaching charges from his equipment cache, preparing to blast through security doors that separated them from the main exit routes. But the facility's lockdown had activated blast barriers that were designed to contain chemical weapons, making escape through conventional routes nearly impossible. Emma's voice crackled through Jake's radio, reporting that she had fought off the security team attacking her position, but Storm had been wounded defending her. The dog was alive, but needed immediate medical attention, and Emma was prepared to extract with the evidence if Jake couldn't escape the facility before the chemical deployment. Jake made the decision that defined the final phase of their mission. He would stay with the prisoners and ensure their evacuation, while Wilson and Marcus attempted to stop the chemical deployment from the command center. Emma would extract with the evidence and ensure that the truth about Project Nightfall reached federal authorities, even if none of them survived the next few minutes. The facility shook with explosions as Wilson's breaching charges opened escape routes through security barriers that hadn't been designed to resist internal attack. Jake helped the weakened prisoners move toward the exits, while Marcus, despite his own injuries, provided covering fire against security personnel who were trying to prevent their escape. Kane's final radio transmission reached them as they moved through the corridors filled with chemical warning alarms. Hayes is dead, the sheriff announced, his voice fading as his own injuries took their toll. Chemical deployment stopped, but I can't guarantee how long the override will hold. Get everyone out now. The escape from the facility was a running battle through corridors filled with smoke and chemical sensors screaming warnings about atmospheric contamination. Jake carried one of the weaker prisoners, while Marcus helped another, both men drawing on reserves of strength that came from absolute determination to save lives rather than preserve their own. Wilson had taken control of the facility's command systems and was using his FBI access codes to contact federal rapid response teams that were already en route to the area. Emergency evacuation procedures were being implemented for the entire valley, while hazardous materials specialists prepared to secure the chemical weapons that Hayes had nearly deployed. They reached the facility's main entrance just as Emma arrived with a Storm, the wounded dog, limping but alert enough to recognize Jake and Marcus. Federal agents were establishing a perimeter around the complex, while medical teams prepared to treat the rescued prisoners and assess their exposure to experimental chemicals. As Jake helped load the last prisoner into a medical helicopter, he realized that their mission was finally complete. Project Nightfall was exposed, the conspiracy was broken, and the veterans who had been used as test subjects were going home to their families. Rodriguez's sacrifice had been vindicated. Michael Chen's investigation had achieved its goal, and the truth about Syria was finally known. Marcus gripped Jake's shoulder as they watched the helicopters disappear into the morning sky. "We did it, brother," he said quietly. "Our team is finally avenged." Jake nodded, feeling a peace that he hadn't experienced since before the Syrian mission that had changed everything. The mountains of Virginia had provided the sanctuary Jake had sought, but not in the way he had expected. Instead of isolation from his past, he had found purpose in confronting it. Instead of running from his responsibilities, he had fulfilled the most important mission of his military career. Storm pressed against his leg, the wounded dog's loyalty unchanged despite everything they had endured together. Emma stood beside them, already planning how to use Michael's evidence to ensure that the full scope of Project Nightfall was exposed to congressional oversight and public scrutiny. Sheriff Kane survived his wounds and provided testimony that implicated dozens of military and political officials in the conspiracy. Colonel Hayes died in the facility, killed by the very security measures he had implemented to protect the illegal weapons program. The chemical agents were safely contained and destroyed under federal supervision, preventing the mass casualties that would have resulted from deployment. Jake Thompson had come to the mountains seeking peace and found war instead. But in fighting that war, he had discovered something more valuable than the isolation he had originally sought. He had found redemption for his fallen teammates, justice for the veterans who had been betrayed by their own government, and purpose that would sustain him for the rest of his life. The evidence that Emma preserved became the foundation for congressional hearings that exposed defense industry corruption and led to reforms in military oversight procedures. The veterans who were rescued from the facility received medical treatment and compensation for their suffering, while their families learned that their sacrifice had served a greater purpose in exposing the conspiracy that had threatened so many others. Marcus returned to active duty with the FBI, specializing in cases involving military contractor fraud and government corruption. His experience with Project Nightfall made him one of the Bureau's most effective investigators of defense industry crimes, ensuring that future conspiracies would be detected before they could claim additional victims. Jake established a foundation dedicated to supporting veterans who had been exposed to chemical weapons, both officially and through illegal experimentation programs. His personal experience with the effects of chemical exposure made him an effective advocate for improved medical care and compensation for affected servicemen and their families. The property in Virginia became a retreat center where veterans could find the peace that Jake had originally sought for himself. Storm, despite his injuries, became a therapy dog who helped other veterans cope with PTSD and the psychological effects of military service. The mountains that had hidden so much darkness became a place of healing and renewal for men and women who had sacrificed everything in service to their country. The war that had followed Jake Thompson home from Syria was finally ended, not through violence, but through the exposure of truth and the implementation of justice. The conspiracy that had murdered his teammates and countless other veterans was destroyed, its architects facing imprisonment or death, while their victims were finally honored for their unwitting sacrifice. Jake stood on the porch of his cabin as the sun set behind the peaks, watching Storm play with other therapy dogs, while veterans from across the country found their own paths to healing in the mountains of Virginia. The peace he had sought through isolation had instead been found through purpose, and the sanctuary he had built was now shared with others who needed the same healing that these ancient mountains could provide. The truth about Project Nightfall would never be forgotten, and the veterans who died exposing it would be remembered as heroes who saved countless lives through their sacrifice. Jake Thompson had completed his mission, honored his fallen teammates, and found the peace that had eluded him since that terrible day in the Syrian mountains when everything changed forever. The war was over, the good guys had won, and in the end, that was the only victory that mattered.